Encouraging, empowering, inspiring each other on this journey of faith. United in purpose, sisters in love we are. Women were leaders.
Hello, sisters. This is Dr. Jia with her monthly podcast. And my message this month is Through the Waters. Subtopic is You Don't Have to Hold Your Breath. I want us to understand that God will accomplish his purpose because of his unfailing love, and to demonstrate that God is worthy of our continuous praise because he loves us unfailing. The love and faithfulness of God. We have the follow up, the giving up, and the looking up, and the lifting up as we think about how God is faithful and where he meets us, how he provides for us, and how he never, ever gives up on us. My text is coming from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verses 10 through 19, and verses 15-13. As Pharaoh approached the Israelites, looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of the Lord, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind him. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind him. 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. And Second Chronicles 30:9 says, if you return to the Lord, then your fellow Israelites and your children will be shown compassion by their captors and will return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and compassionate. He will not turn his face from you if you return to him. My sisters, I ask you this question. Could you imagine being lost at sea? The waves toss your boat back and forth, and as you try to grasp where you are, you realize that you can't find any markers to help you. The water is constantly changing. However, you remember that sailors for generations have used one of the only constant things you can see, the stars. They would observe the North Star and other various constellations. Those constant benchmarks would guide sailors home. It was the one hope, constant, and comfort that they had as they held their breath, that something would change the course of events for them. And in an ever-changing world, it is hard to find something constant, stable, and faithful. I believe that I'm talking to my sisters that this day that as you listen to this podcast, that you feel as if it can be hard at times to feel like we don't have to hold our breath in hopes that something good will work out, holding on to the hope that things won't look like they do or feel like they do forever, that something and someone will be constant, stable, and faithful. Stressed, strained, and obliterated by the toils and snares and unforeseen pressures of life at times. It is just hard at times to feel like there is breathing room and we feel underwater. Taken off guard, as I am sure the Egyptians felt as the walls of the Red Sea came closing in on them. The Red Sea, as we know it to be a large body of water, powerful, overbearing, and consuming. Oceans are large bodies of water covering 70.8% of the surface of the earth and contains 97% of the earth's water. According to National Ocean Service, the deeper you go under sea, the greater the pressure of the water pushing down on you. For every 33 feet you go down, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere. And at such depths, the pressure of holding your breath can be intense. I don't care how good you are at holding your breath. At some point, the pressure on the inside is depriving, and the pressure on the outside is just as crushing. And many of us, in some situations and in some seasons and at very present times, have been holding our breath, holding out for the same old, waiting to exhale and come up for oxygen to receive the promise made by man or even those that we have made to ourselves without delivery, holding on to the thought that this circle that has weaved itself around us is attached to a breakthrough. Jesus, I'm holding my breath and my faith is being stretched. You've been holding your breath because you've been under the bondage, disappointment, shame, lies, closed and locked doors of the pharaohs in your life for so long that to breathe, to catch your breath and trust in the faithfulness of God seems nearly impossible, distant, and maybe not even for you. Holding our breath, waiting for the qualified and a rescue outside of God. But I've come by on today to remind you and to restore your hope and your faith towards a knowing that for Christians, the one constant thing in our lives is God. God delivers his people. We have constantly appreciated that in spite of their weaknesses and their doubt, God fulfilled his promises and purposes, not because his people deserved it, but because he is faithful in his unfailing love. His love defends us. His love is the strength of our soul. His love redeems us from the pressure and depths of bondage. His love calls us to a stillness in his faithfulness and love. And when we choose to remain still on the inside, when we choose to allow the current of God to carry us and not allow the challenges of life drown us, calm and trusting God to do for us what only he can do, we are exhibiting our faith in him. Even in our stillness, even as we exhale, breathe, we can take action in our obedience. In verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." In their stillness, God instructs the Israelites to move on. We cry out before God that we no longer want to keep sitting in the same minutia, the same stench, the same struggle, the same relationship, the same job, the same places of oppression and depression, looking for the love of others to complete us and fulfill. The same faithfulness of God we search for in his creation, only to find ourselves constantly crying out before God. Despite his instructions to move on, how many of us are complaining against the Lord about our circumstances, or perhaps waiting for God to deliver us into a promise, but the Lord is telling us to first simply move on. God is constantly coming for you and I. He is telling us that for you to come to know what and who I really have for you, to be able to stop holding your breath for something greater than me, I need you to change your geography to enhance your gratitude. I need to have you endure a little bit of hardships to keep you humble. I need to have you to struggle for a moment so that you will come to know me as the strength of your soul. I need you to move because where you are holding is holding you up from the promise. I need you to understand what I have placed in your hands to not only help yourself but others. Time and time again, the Bible shows us that hardships and other tests of our faith yield valuable rewards in Christ. The faithfulness of God does not and will not always result in a yes or getting what we want, but it will be what we need. It will transform us, settle us, comfort us, deliver us, heal us, break us, and build us. And it will be for our good. It will be his means to get us towards what he has for us. We are no different from the Israelites. God, in his unfailing love and faithfulness towards us, continues to try to get to us to move through the waters to the promise. So, journey with me as we see Israel through the follow up of Pharaoh, the giving up of a desperate people, the looking up to a man named Moses, who God has raised up for his people, and the lifting up from God as he leads the Israelites through dry land towards their freedom. The book of Exodus, whose authorship is attributed to Moses by early Jewish and Christian tradition, describes the miraculous deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and the establishment of a covenant relationship between these former slaves and their God, Yahweh. With its vivid imagery of the burning bush, the splitting of the water, and the cloud by day and the fire by night, the Exodus story has been retold and reinterpreted within other biblical texts and in the art, literature, and music of many different cultures. Also, it has inspired men and women to fight against oppression in various times and places. While the narrative of the deliverance from Egypt is perhaps the most familiar aspect of Exodus, the establishing of the covenant of Mount Sinai and the obligations and legal codes that follow are also central to the book. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Pentateuch in the Hebrew Bible and the second book in the Torah of the Jewish Tanakh, opening where the book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph in Egypt. However, by the time we get to chapter 1, verse 8, we have skipped 300 years into the enslavement of the Israelites. The English title Exodus is derived from the Greek word that means going out or departure. In the Tanakh, the Hebrew title is the book of, and these are the names or names. This title comes from the first Hebrew word of the book, which in English begins, and these are the names. Two major sections divide this Old Testament text. Chapters 1 through 18 form a narrative that details the enslavement and subsequent escape of the Israelites from Egypt. Chapters 19 through 40, we see the covenant relationship with God in these chapters. The covenant relationship between these fugitive slaves and their God despite their sin. And the Exodus, the coming out of the people, have come after what has been a perceived potential political and military threat of the Israelites by this king called Pharaoh. First, he imposes forced labor on the Israelites. Second, he intensifies the forced labor with harsher treatment. Thirdly, he orders two midwives to kill Hebrew baby boys. Fourth, he instructs the Egyptians to throw into the Nile every boy born to the Hebrews. Ironically, despite Pharaoh's multiple plans, Moses, a Hebrew boy, is born, survives, and grows up to lead the Israelites of Egypt. The very thing that he survived and that was meant to destroy him was going to be the very thing that he delivered. Somebody needs to tell their neighbor, somebody needs to tell whoever's sitting with you while you're listening to this podcast that God's plans always will not fail. God always has a plan for his purposes to prosper. Every attempt by Pharaoh failed. His refusal to acknowledge God and obey God's command to let my people go only caused God to show his mighty hand and that he was going to stay in constant pursuit of his chosen people. We serve a God that has always been and continues to be in pursuit of you and I. 10 plagues he inflicted upon Egypt. Moses strikes the Nile with his staff, causing its waters to become bloody and polluting all of the waters in Egypt. A plague of frogs covers the entire land of Egypt. Aaron strikes the dust, and gnats suddenly infest the entire nation. Egypt is filled with great swarms of flies, but none appear in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites live. All Egyptian livestock suddenly become sick and die, but not one Israelite livestock is affected. After Moses tosses soot from a machine into the air from a furnace, festering boils break out on people and animals. He strikes with hail and lightning, and before his plague, God tells Moses and Pharaoh that the purpose of the plagues was so that they might see his power and that his fame might spread throughout the earth. And Pharaoh still does not honor his word. God sends a strong east wind that blows the worst locust plague in Egyptian history. Pharaoh repents. The Lord removes the locust, and yet again, Pharaoh reneges. And for 3 days, God sends a terrifying darkness over all of Egypt, and his final refusal has resulted in the infliction of the death of firstborn sons. The Lord tells Moses that this plague will result in Israel's freedom. The reckless love of God comes for those who he calls his own. God fights harder for the promise for us that he gave than we do at times. If God can free over 600,000 people from Egypt after 430 years of bondage, if God can part the waters for his people to pass through to their freedom, guide them with a pillar of cloud that leads them by day and a pillar of fire that leads them by night, is there really anything that you are going through today that is too hard for God? Is there really anything that you're holding your breath through, thinking that you're waiting for God to show up and he already has, but just because it doesn't look the way you thought it was going to look or sound the way you thought it was going to sound, you're still holding your breath? The faithfulness of God will not fail us, and it is the life vest that allows us to breathe and stop holding our breath. And I want you to understand that the intentional methods of God are ultimately about him being glorified in our lives. How God moves even in our lack of understanding about his methods always results in our benefit to experience his faithfulness and his love. God purposely set the Israelites up to win as he created a smokescreen before Pharaoh and the Egyptian army that made the Israelites appear to be confused before Pharaoh and as if they were wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the deserts. So I'm saying to you today, my sisters, that sometimes God has to change the course and reroute things in order to keep us paying attention to how he is moving over our own agendas. Sometimes God has to show his passivity after he has given us time and time again to be the recipients of his active nature that constantly wants to draw us to him unto repentance and righteousness. Don't miss the act of God that is leading you through the waters. After 10 plagues, Pharaoh still did not concede with multiple opportunity to do so. He was insistent that he was greater than God, more powerful than God, and that he was going to keep Israel in bondage. The audacity of God to show him up, the audacity of God to show that his faithfulness, his plans, and his purpose would prevail. God tells Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue in his arrogance, in his emotional response. I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. The judgment of Egypt was not over. In his pride, he makes another bold attempt to go after Israel after he has let them go. He sends the Egyptian army, including 600 chariots, to capture the Israelites by the Red Sea. My sisters, I'm telling you to pay attention. Insanity, pride, and hard heart will keep fighting battles where we are fighting against the will of God over allowing God to be in the battle with us and fight with us. God is jealous for you and me, and the lengths by which he will go supersede anything that you or I can do and have proven ourselves capable of doing when we are holding out for something different that we think is better than God. His love is timeless and does not waver. His love is ruthless and does not back down to the unjust tactics of the enemy that seeks only to steal, kill, and destroy. Pharaoh did everything he could to oppress Israel. He did everything he could to snuff their joy, their faith, and their freedoms, to keep them holding their breath in hopes that something greater was going to come. But God, a God in whom we are to rest our faith and not harden our hearts from the scar tissues of life, but to allow the faith of God to infuse our souls. We are free to use God's faith, faith that cannot be stopped by our unbelief because it is alive and unshakable. Faith that Mark 11:22 through 24 reminds us that whosoever asks and believes will receive and is free to use God's faith. Faith that allows us to live victoriously over our flesh. Faith that is holy and causes us to trust and obey over the worry of what we see. The Egyptians were coming, marching after the Israelites, and there they were facing the Red Sea and questioning God, yelling at Moses, what are you facing that despite what God has shown you about him, delivered you in from him, resurrected you from regardless of your faithfulness and faithlessness, that you are now questioning the move of God to get you out of bondage, crying out before him, not in faith, declaring that you are the redeemed of the Lord, that you are more than a conqueror in Christ Jesus, that no weapon formed shall prosper. God, I trust you. God, you have never failed me and you won't fail me now. If you did it before, you can do it again. No, you are crying out to God and you are ready to give up. And I'm telling you on today that the giving up and the lifting up is your portion. I'm telling you that when we stop getting caught up in our used to's, comforts with the struggles and disappointments, holding our breath for one more thing that has nothing to do with our victory, what we are telling God is that we like our stuff. What he has and what he has done is mediocre. Sometimes we don't even recognize the enemy because we are familiar with him and comfortable with his presence. God delivered you from the abusive relationship, but still he calls and you go back. God sparing your life, healing you and keeping you, but you won't stick to the diet. God gave you the job you asked for, or even got you out of the job that was mistreating you, but now you keep showing up late to the new position. And it is not until God puts us in some uncomfortable situations so that he can be glorified as he teaches us more about himself and accomplishes his purposes for our lives. God knows that it can seem easier to give up over looking up to the hills where our help comes from. God knows that our first response will be to retreat to what has been easier and even appear to be our better off. The Israelites are tripping. Why did you not just leave us where we were, Moses, serving the Egyptians? Why did you bring us out here to die? Better off in their misery because that is all they knew and had accepted. No one is coming. Moses, who told you that you were the man for the job? Moses, Moses, Moses. I can imagine the shouts and the chants. Fear was greater than their faith at this moment. But I want you to say to yourself, I'm going to be still. God's going to fight for me. I want you to say to yourself, be still and trust that God is working on my behalf. Be still and know that God has given you everything pertaining to life and godliness. I want you to be still and know that God has given you everything that you need to stand firm, that God is faithful and true no matter what changes around us or within us. Our circumstances, nor does our fear or our faithlessness move God. God won't turn on who he is. He does not compromise who he is. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. We will change based on what we feel and how others treat us, but God is not moved by our fickleness, and we are to be grateful to be in the hands of an unchanging, stable, and constant God that is leading us through the waters, and we can breathe. Sisters, even more, God is saying, look up, stand up where you are. I will rescue and deliver you. I am your protection. Don't forfeit the promise. I got you. Stop looking in the wrong places. The Egyptians are not what your issue. The sea is not your issue. Your faith is your issue. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Watch me work. When you are feeling boxed in, holding your breath, stuck with no feeling of the bottom of the ocean floor, look at the faithful God through the eyes of your faith. Look up to God and lift up what God has placed in your hands to guide you through the difficult places, and breathe. So thank you, my sisters, for joining me this Monday for my podcast with Women World Leaders. Thanks for listening to Women World Leaders. Join us each week as we explore together God's extravagant love and your courageous purpose. Visit our website at www.womenworldleaders.com to submit a prayer request, register for an upcoming event, and support the ministry. From his heart to yours, we are Women World Leaders. All content is copyrighted by Women World Leaders and cannot be used without express written consent. But ladies, I also want to remind you, you want to hear more of Content and Preached Word by Dr. Jia, please join us on Sunday mornings virtual through YouTube. Anointed Touch Ministries Outreach Center come to you every Sunday at 10:15 with the powerful word of God. And on Wednesday nights, you can join us for Wednesday nights in the Word as we have Bible study at 7:30 p.m. on Facebook Live. So God bless you, and go forth and remember to breathe.